Truth of it is, and I think this is something that I've learned because I've listened to older folk talk about how certain people got together and got married and started families, is that there's no right way, quote unquote, to get into a relationship. Because you can be out here busy saying, oh, I can't have sex on the first date, and then
the royal penis is clean, Your Highness.
Welcome to the Breakdown Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is a man who likes his women the same exact way he likes his yogurt. He is also a man who definitely includes running his mouth to his cardio routine. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. And I am here to speak about women. Okay, actually, no, I'm not really trying to speak about women. It's just something that women talk about a lot, or some things that women talk about a lot. But I feel like it's more about understanding than it even is about women, or talking about stuff that women, will debate on and talk to us about and try to womansplain to us, even though such a term doesn't exist as of yet. But, the point of it is, women have been saying some things to men, and women have been saying some things about men. The only thing that I'm trying to do in this episode is to at least try to bring some understanding from our side of the table that stuff isn't always as straightforward as you think it is. And hopefully at the end of it, if you're a man, at least you'll feel like your side of the story is being listened to and someone is actually considering you for once. And if you're a woman, at least you'll understand that stuff isn't always as straightforward as you think. But whether you feel differently about it or not, either way, I hope you listen all the way till the end. And should you like it, should you not like it, should you have a different form of feedback, or should you want to, suggest a potential topic and or guest I should have on the podcast, then the DMs are always open. The social media links are in the description. And should you feel a little lazy or you don't feel like, going all the way to check them out, I usually mention them at the end of the episode. So, you can listen all the way till the end for that. And, I hope you enjoy what it is that you're listening to, so much so that you listen all the way till the end. Now, with all of that said, I do need to get to the topics that I have for today. And I want to kick things off by talking about something that, admittedly, I will say in all of my years of podcasting, I'm not the biggest fan of discussing. And that is the topic of consent. Now, normally I'd get into a full-on story as to how I ended up, bringing this up as a topic, blah, blah, blah. Oh, so I stumbled across this video. But no, there is no video, there is no particular clip. It's just one Reddit post that is actually getting into this, and there isn't even a story around it. The thing is, I'm just not the biggest fan of discussing it, and I normally don't discuss it as much because I think during the COVID period around 2020, 2021, I did cover it a little bit here and there, especially when a lot of women were busy yelling out that men are trash. But ever since that time, I haven't really discussed it as such. But in this particular case, considering that it was someone that asked a question regarding consent, and it is definitely a guy, and I'll explain why in a second, I just kind of thought about it and I was like, you know what, let me just discuss it, not from a woman's point of view, not from a politically neutral or socially neutral point of view. Let me discuss this from a man's point of view, because we never usually hear that as much, especially when it comes to a topic like this one. So the gist of this entire thing is actually quite simple. It was someone that just hopped onto Reddit and just asked, straightforward one statement and asked, and I quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, can consent be withdrawn during the act?" End quote. That's quite literally all that he asked. And, of course, the short answer is yes. But when I read this, first of all, you wouldn't expect a woman to be asking this question, because consent is kind of a tool that's mostly been used by women. And it's kind of hard to think that a babe would actually come out to ask a question like this. Mostly because even if she'd have thought of asking a question like this, she'd have probably, at least tried to discuss it with her friends, who would have quickly told her that, oh, when it comes to consent, it's not like when you give consent, he's supposed to do everything, blah, blah. Well, granted, I could be wrong about that, but for the most part, that's something that I've seen happen quite a number of times. But when it comes to guys, if you're a guy and you haven't involved yourself or even seen any of the gender wars that have taken place over the past slightly over half a decade that it's been going on, then you probably wouldn't get why people would have discussions like this. The whole, withdrawing consent, consent this, consent that. And so I can get why to some degree the idea of withdrawing consent can seem a little bit foreign to a lot of guys. But the long and short of it is, if you are engaging in the act or fucking, as some of us like to casually put it, a babe can withdraw consent at any given point in time. Granted, you can also withdraw consent at any given point in time. That's kind of the whole quote-unquote rules to consent thing that's around there. And that's quite literally it. Even when I was saying it at the beginning, after I read out the statement, it was pretty straightforward. It's just a simple yes. Except that this is something that's always been said from a woman's point of view and from a politically correct point of view. When it comes to the reality of it for guys, it can be a little bit different from what some people think, and it might actually even be a little bit trickier when you're talking about doing the act. Because the thing is, people have always spoken about the idea of consent for the past, call it 7-ish years, where people have spoken about, when it comes to consent, you should always get consent before you do anything with a babe. And it is something that was hammered along quite a bit before it kind of died down from social media. But for the most part, it was kind of par for the course for most people to kind of, whenever they were discussing it, say that, you shouldn't do blah, blah, blah without consent. But every single time you look at the idea of consent and the discussions around consent, it's always been taken from a more female point of view, whereby consent was sort of this tool of power, or this power that you have, whereby you can say yes or no at any given point in time, and it's mostly within the topic, or should I say the subject, of having sex, or any form of intimate relations with someone of either the same or the opposite sex. And so when you look at it from that point, it's very easy to be like, I can withdraw consent, and consent is this, consent is that. Actually, what most women, or should I say most people that would discuss consent, would try to explain it, they would try to use this dumb analogy of, consent is like tea. If you make tea for someone, or if you give someone tea and they don't want it because they prefer coffee, then it's perfectly okay. If you give them coffee and they wanted tea, then it's okay to not have to force it down their throats, blah, blah, blah. And for a lot of that discussion, it would basically try to introduce different scenarios whereby, if you offer someone tea and they take a little bit, and they reject it, it's still okay. You can be pissed, but it's fine. They'd always try to make it seem as though it's a very simple thing. If someone simply withdraws consent or decides that, they don't want to give you consent anymore, it's perfectly okay. And I kind of used to hear that, and I always used to feel like there was something a little bit off. And at least now that I have had, a little bit more time, a couple of years to think about it and process it, I think I finally found out why it is that I don't really like that analogy. Because to be quite honest, I think that the tea analogy when it comes to consent is a massive pack of bullshit. And the reason I say this is very simple, actually. In that entire analogy, whether you want to use tea, whether you want to use coffee, whether you are using a different set of cups or any other form of BS, there is one very critical component that people often forget whenever it comes to using that analogy and thinking that it works perfectly for the definition of consent. And that is the fact that you are dealing with peak human physical pleasure, and that in and of itself makes it a lot harder to control than most people would care to actually realize, okay? Especially whenever they're having these discussions. Let me explain it to you like this. And, this one can apply to whether you're ovulating for the women, and also when you're horny as a guy. When you guys are on heat and you want to be with someone in that way, you will go ahead and you will put in the work to go and do it with them. If you are doing it with them, and especially when you are doing it and you seem to be enjoying it quite a bit, if someone wants to withdraw consent at that point, while it is perfectly okay, it is a little bit harder to do than most people care to actually put into realistic fact. because for the most part, when you are in the middle of doing it, it is so good, it is almost like you are addressing this craving that you're having, which makes it a little bit harder to stop, especially if all of that power is within your control at that time. Because if you've ever noticed this, the more pleasure you feel as a human being, at a certain level, the harder it is for your conscious mind to actually take control and stop you from doing shit that your body seems to be enjoying quite a bit. Now, that does not mean that, as a guy, if a babe withdraws consent, you should go on because, it's hard to control yourself. Of course, you have to try, but all I'm trying to say is it's usually not as easy as people like to make it seem whenever they decide to bring the tea explanation. And with that one, I would even much rather suggest a different one, because when it comes to something like physical pleasure to the point where sex is, you have to think about it differently. It's not just a singular act. It's something that's more of a process. I would probably even try to put it more akin to you driving and actually increasing speed as you are going towards climax. So when you think about it, sex for a lot of people, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, even though you're not really talking about stroke speed or how good it is almost like driving a car. Okay, when it gets good and you guys seem to be enjoying yourselves, it's great. But if someone was to tell you to stop right then and there, you probably could, but when you're right towards the peak of physical pleasure, it becomes a hell of a lot harder. It's like asking someone to stop the car when you're going at 100, even 160, even 80, okay? It becomes a hell of a lot harder to hit the brakes and for you to stop right dead there and there. First of all, it's even considered dangerous. But that's besides the point. The point is, it's not as easy to do, and it's not like every car can stop within the same level of distance. So, in as much as people will say that withdrawing consent is something that is definitely possible, I just want y'all to know it's a little bit harder for some than for others. But that being said, now to the fellas, I want you guys to know something very simple about consent. Consent will almost always fall towards the woman's side as opposed to you, because they are more looked at as victims and we are more looked at as perpetrators. So I will tell you this: if you do not get consent from a babe, don't do it. If the babe gives you consent, go ahead and do it. If the babe seems to flip-flop yes, no, I'm not really sure we should be doing this, then at that point you gauge. If it is more yes than no, then maybe, depending on how well you are at trying things out, you can try it if the babe is okay with it. But if that babe does not seem very sure and you cannot eke out more of a yes than a no, I will tell you for a fact, don't even bother. If you feel like it's hard for you to gauge out that maybe, don't even bother. No amount of pussy is worth destroying your reputation the way being called a predator or an abuser or a creep will. There is no amount of pussy that can help you get around that. So, to not put yourself in that position would be a hell of a lot better than to test out the odds, hoping that the person wouldn't put you in that situation. So, all this to say, if you do not feel like this babe is giving you the green light, then treat that shit like a red light. If you're not sure that there's any greens that are coming, treat that shit like a red light up until you get a green light. If anything, if the babe actually wants you guys to do it, she will probably show you more of a green light than a red one, and at that point, then you can go ahead and do it. And I will tell you for free, if there is one superpower that you as a man can have that will help you quite a bit whenever it comes to dealing with the opposite sex, it is the ability to turn down pussy. If you can turn down pussy, whether it has consent or not, you can protect yourself from a hell of a lot of shit, as opposed to a lot of guys that will not be able to protect themselves and will not be able to control themselves well enough that they may end up being looked at as predators simply because a babe withdrew consent and this guy still went on ahead. Either way, with that said, I could be wrong. This is something that definitely can create debate, very heated debate that is, so I'm going to leave it at that and move it on to our main topic of this episode. Now, if you've been in the dating market for not too long, you've probably noticed that it's not like people do the whole dating thing the same way all the time. And in some instances, if you've either tried to go out on a date or if you've been asked out on a couple of dates, you might have realized that some people might be taking a little bit more of a personal touch and putting it in their dating by telling you to go over to their place. Now, this is something that most women will probably attest to as opposed to the men. And apparently there's a woman that wasn't feeling too good about this entire thing, and she decided to post it up online. Now, she did suggest some version of dating classes, which is actually the title of the post that she put up, which is dating classes. And she goes into how it's such a bad thing that people are, trying to do a first date by having you come over to the place. And even worse still, there's women that are doing that. And when it comes to communication, like people are busy saying, very nasty things to each other, and yet they aren't even all that close. And while she does have some interesting points around this entire thing and trying to suggest that maybe people should have classes for it, I think maybe she might not get the entire idea very well. Either way, I'm going to read what she posted up, then give my thoughts on it. So like I said, it's called dating classes, and she says, and I quote, "Something is terribly wrong with young people's approach to dating these days. Why do men ask women to visit their houses on the first date? Why do women agree to this? Why send suggestive texts yet you don't know each other that well? Why are you in a relationship with someone who hasn't met your friends or family? I feel like someone should open a dating school to teach youngsters how to relate with the opposite gender." End quote. Okay, particularly interesting thoughts. Why communicate with someone and send them suggestive messages yet you haven't been knowing each other all that well, and you haven't been in a relationship, and like, why are you in a relationship and you haven't met the family? Okay, she's asked a couple of interesting questions, and before I get into anything, I want to at least start by asking, are you sure that the problem here is young people and dating, or the problem is you and the fact that you're putting dating in a box? And I know this is gonna sound like, maybe I'm busy glorifying something, but like, I'm not trying to say that what she's saying is wrong. It's just, I feel like she's putting dating in general in a box. And I say this not because I'm for, a babe should come over to my place for the first date and all, but I think that there's a lot more to this than just going through the act of going to dates and communicating to each other in a certain way that makes dating. I find that a lot of women will usually be complaining about dating and how bad it is, but the problem is that when you ask them about what good dating is, they glorify the act or the specific acts of dating, not necessarily the process of it. Because I think she's looking at the act and it's an issue, and yet the truth of it is the act isn't really that big of a deal if you look at it from a long-term, I'm going to land something with this person kind of view. Because when you think about it, if you were to take 3 sets of couples who started dating in different ways, all 3 of them, and then on top of that you find that they've been married for 20 plus years, do you really think people are going to care about how that first date was supposed to go or what they were supposed to have done? Because the way I think about it, that's not even the biggest problem in this. Like, I'd want to know how they managed to relate with one another, what they thought about each other, and what made it such that they could stick together so that they could have a particularly long-term partnership. But someone is out here busy complaining about going over to a guy's place. Like, truth of it is, and I think this is something that I've learned because I've listened to older folk talk about how certain people got together and got married and started families, is that there's no right way, quote unquote, to get into a relationship. Because you can be out here busy saying, oh, I can't have sex on the first date. And then someone will come out and reference John Legend and Chrissy Teigen and the fact that they had sex on the first date and they've had a happy marriage for years. Like, people will do that. People will tell you how, you'll never find love in the club, going out isn't going to help you, blah, blah. But there's people that met at the club, started seeing each other and go to the club together, and they've had a long marriage that has exceeded 2 decades and they're very happy together. There's people that will tell you, don't get with a babe that drinks booze. Or, the type that drink aren't great. But guess what? There's babes out here that drink. They consume their booze, granted maybe they do it responsibly, but they've been in particularly good marriages for a pretty good amount of time. So to think that there's a right way to get into a relationship, there's a right way to date, I think is very, very misguided for quite a number of people. And whenever I see a babe busy referencing stuff like this and talk about how, young men don't know how to date nowadays, I'm just like, nah, the problem isn't that young guys don't know how to date. It's that you have your idea of dating and you have a problem with the fact that other people are finding other ways to do it that don't fit that ideology that you have. Because when you look at the origins of dating, a lot of times people would think that, this has been something that's been done since time immemorial. Nah, like this is something that's like a little over 200 years old. And yes, it's been ingrained as, some near staple kind of thing as far as culture is concerned. But for the most part, people were going out on dates because that's how they would see each other. They would go on dates a lot because that's when they would get a chance to communicate and be with each other. Otherwise, communication was a lot harder and wasn't as easy. You look at it today, and my communication is nigh instantaneous whenever I'm texting with someone. If it's a phone call, it's even more instantaneous than that. So, as far as communication is concerned, we don't need the date, or at least the old school date, as much when you look at it from that angle. So, if someone wants to be all suggestive and flirty, then there's nothing wrong with that, because in as much as you may be trying to get to know each other, this is stuff that people back in the day were doing. Being flirty is perfectly normal because that is an act that people do as a way to generate desire and to also retain it. Then you also look at just the date itself, and the truth of it is, it was something that worked for its time. As per its origins, it absolutely worked for its time. We've moved forward 200 years and people want to keep the same exact setup as that and maybe modify it to their liking. And while I don't see anything wrong with that, I also don't see anything wrong with people trying out new ways of achieving the same goal. It's part of the reason why a couple of years back I did make the suggestion that Netflix and chill is actually the next evolution that comes after the typical date. And I can remember I got a bit of flack for that, and I had quite a debate with a few of my female friends on it, but honestly I felt like that was quite true at the time. What I didn't know is that while Netflix has only been around for, say a decade or so, if not a little bit more than that, when you look at the act itself, it is something that's existed for quite some time. Like, I know people's parents who basically got together just by a cohabitation that started with the lady going to the man's house and then ending up spending like an entire weekend there, goes back to her place. Eventually that turns into a week, then 2 weeks. Then all of a sudden they've started a family. And guess what? Over 30 years down the line, they're still together. So are you telling me that whatever it was that was done was wrong? And yes, you can argue that it's a nuanced case, but do we have any statistics that show that the typical date has actually yielded more success as opposed to Netflix and chill or having the first date from the house? Like, there really isn't any real stat that can say that going on the typical dinner date or doing the typical date as per this old, outdated set of rules is how it's supposed to go. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think that there are some things that are important, like, ensuring that your friends get a chance to vet the person and so on. And if you can, before dowry negotiations and shit, your parents and maybe even your siblings can do that as well. But at the end of it, it's not like there is a proper formula on how to do this that has guaranteed success. There's people that did the typical date and they didn't even last long. There's a ton of people that do that and don't even make it to a relationship. There's people that love sex on the first date and they've been married for years, decades even. There's people that start doing it at work. Decades after that, they're having a thriving family. There's people that started it out on the internet and right now they're together and they are getting married. At the end of the day, there is no real formula to this. So it's not that there has to be a dating school. I just think that people should maybe try and find more respectful ways of trying to be with each other and probably be more upfront with what it is that they want from each other. So at the end of it, it's not really that they are wrong or they're not doing it right, but rather that maybe you think that how you do it is supposed to be the only way that it's done. To which I'll say that isn't entirely true. As we've seen throughout history, there are definitely more ways to skin this cat. And to kind of conclude all of this, what I am trying to say is, if you do believe that, the way that people are trying to date today is wrong, and people aren't following a formula and shit is particularly wrong, then respectfully speaking, you're the one that's wrong. All of this is a matter of evolution. People are evolving to the times and the standards and what it is that society is willing to allow. Traditional dating worked because it was an evolution of its time and it seemed to work particularly well for young people, and I'm sure there were old people that probably sat back and said that that wasn't a very good thing. So maybe, just maybe, what you are seeing is an evolution throughout time, and maybe it's not such a bad thing. But either way, I could be wrong about this, and maybe this woman was onto something, but either way, I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open. On IG, it is at the breaktime_podcast. On Facebook, it is at the breaktime podcast. On X, it is at Bagaka the D. And on Bluesky, it is at the breaktimepod.bsky.social. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.
But what I believe is that if you put a pastor and a prostitute in one room, one is likely to convert the other.